Brett and I needed support.
Yeah.
Wait, so how did you know what the baby is down there? Just did they win that? Okay. Just to engage in the spirit where but every day that she passes, she's giving it. So is that how we do
Instead of walking
No, they said the second necessary.
No. What did you do?
Got in there a couple weeks, and then took off once I she's in the computer.
Okay, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Not great. Can you hear? That's better. Maybe too loud. Let me go down a bit. Welcome. It's good to be here this morning. And we are going to be studying today 2 Corinthians 8:16 through 9:5. Before we start, though, we're just a reminder that the upper room is open for prayer requests, and Earl will be there. And if you need to do that, make yourself available there anytime today. Okay, today's passage is, I think, very, very interesting and very practical. Again, it's 2 Corinthians 8:16 through chapter 9, verse 5. We get an insight into really a special occasion in the early church where the Gentile churches had the chance to show their love with their wallets and contribute in a coordinated, cooperative fashion. We're going to look at this today from a historical perspective, and then I think we're going to find some practical things that we can use and we do use today. Let's read this passage. 2 Corinthians 8:16, starting with 8:16. Thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same concern I have for you. For Titus not only welcomed our appeal, but he is coming to you with much enthusiasm and on his own initiative. And we are sending along with him the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. What is more, he was chosen by the churches to accompany us as we carry the offering, which we administer in order to honor the Lord himself and to show our eagerness to help. We want to avoid any criticism of the way we administer this liberal gift, for we are taking pains to do what is right, and not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of man. In addition, we're sending with them our brother who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous. and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and co-worker among you. As for our brothers, they are representatives of the churches in an honor to Christ. Therefore, show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. Chapter 9. There's no need for me to write to you about this service to the Lord's people, for I know your eagerness to help, and I've been boasting about it to the Macedonians, telling them that since last year you and Achaia were ready to give, and your enthusiasm has stirred some of them to action, or most of them to action. But I'm sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you in this matter should not prove hollow, but that you may be ready as I said you would be. For if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to say anything about you, would be ashamed of having been so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to visit you in advance and finish the arrangements for the generous gift you have promised. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given. Let me start with a question. Think about it. You don't have to answer this out loud. You can think about it in your mind, but when you're dealing with money, who do you trust the most? Do you trust a broker or a banker or a relative or the government or your mattress or the church or no one? Think about that for a second. Who do you trust with your money? So in that regard, looking at these verses, what is going on here? What's happening on a high level? What's this about? David?
Paul is helping to encourage a collection among the mostly Gentile churches who help their mostly Jewish Christian brothers and sisters. Because there's a famine going on in Palestine.
Probably so. Yes, probably so. Okay, good. That's a great synopsis of really where we're going today. Paul had, we know, we've said this before, Brent mentioned this last week, I think we've talked about this all through 2 Corinthians. Paul had his enemies and his critics, and they weren't hesitant to really criticize him about anything. And they certainly wouldn't be hesitant to accuse them of keeping part of this collection for himself. So I think he takes some steps to make it a little more difficult to level the charge against him. If you want to criticize somebody, you can do it. You can drum up the charges. But, in this case, I think he's going to try to make it a little more difficult to level this charge. He wants to make this clear before God and men that he's above suspicion here. I think it's interesting that Paul could write like a lyric poet. He could write on that level. He could also write as a master theologian, which he was. But in this case, I think he is acting with the accuracy of an accountant or an auditor. He's basically setting up principles here that's in full agreement with the generally accepted accounting principles, the GAAP principles we have today, or the FASB, the FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, or the AICPA, American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, I believe. He's doing all those things to really, I think, dot the I's and cross the T's here in what he's trying to do. Okay, as David mentioned, specifically the offering was what? It was to the Jerusalem church, right? Why was it so important to the Jerusalem church? And why was it important for the Jerusalem church? David's mentioned one thing. Probably the famine was going on at this time. Why was it also important to the Jerusalem church that these churches contribute? Or in reverse, why was it important that these churches would contribute to them, to the Jerusalem church?
I think every time you contribute to something, you kind of belong to that.
Sure, right. They are contributing in a very specific way to a need that's out there. they know about. And I think I like the way you say that it's basically, Margot, they're saying you become part of that work in that contribution. Okay, very good. Ryan.
Giving, first, human giving is an opportunity to God to bless you even further.
Yes.
And furthermore, every location has something another person or another location doesn't have. This is the basis of trade.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Wealth, it's more than wealth than raw materials. It's the circulation of the materials and the goods that are made from them.
Right.
People each working in their own place are blessing others by doing that, even if they do it for their own greed.
Exactly. And we're going to circle back to that, I hope, at the very end and talk about some of those motivations. But excellent point. Okay, so the suspicions. What are the suspicions around Paul right now with the Corinthians?
That he's been mishandling the funds.
That he's been mishandling the funds. And I think we're going to see later on, this is chapter 8 and 9, we're going to see in chapter 11, whoever covers that, that we'll be talking more about this, that this is a very specific criticism that he was misusing the funds. Going back to chapter 2, when we studied chapter 2, Paul uses a term which I thought was really interesting at the time, and that he calls his critics, particularly these false teachers that are wormed their way into the Corinthian church, he calls them a curious term called peddlers of the gospel. And this wasn't we're kind of, when we use the term peddler, it's not necessarily a bad term. The Greek term he uses is a bad term. It is a crook, somebody who's selling something of little value or no value, sells it, collects the money, and then absconds out of town. Like we used to call it snake oil salesman, that kind of thing. That's kind of the term here. So, he's comparing himself to those peddlers. He said, in this case, peddlers of God's word. So that brings us to the point. Then what does he do to address the concerns? What is he doing?
One thing is he's sending someone else.
Exactly. He's sending someone else. And in sending someone else, he's doing something very interesting in this passage. If you think about it, I'm sure everyone in here at some point has asked for a reference from somebody else or given a reference. I've gotten, I think, 2 or 3 requests at the end of the semester from students this week about, would you write me a reference for an internship or a job or something like that? And I always tell them there are 3 important things that I would like to have, I want to know for writing a reference. Anybody want to venture those through any one of the 3? What do you do when you got to make sure when you ask somebody for a reference?
They have to know you somewhat.
They have to know you somewhat, right? You have to be familiar with that person in some way. What else?
Not be a relative.
Not be a relative. Yeah, that's probably a good thing. Yes, for sure.
They have to have somebody who trusts in your competence.
Right, exactly. The person writing the reference has to have some bit of trust in your confidence. One thing I ask my students always is, send me a resume. Send me your latest resume, because that really will help me. I'm familiar with them, or I wouldn't write them a reference, but at least send me your resume so I can, look at it and also know some other things about them, extracurricular and jobs they've had and things like that. All right? There's another thing that's really important. I always tell them this. I don't tell people ask me for reference. I tell this in my classes. I say, when you ask somebody for a reference, make sure there's one important thing that's there, that they're going to probably give you a good reference, right? You want to make sure that they're going to give you a good reference when you ask somebody for that. Well, verses 16 through 24 are letters of reference. They're essentially, what Paul's doing here is he's sending these people out to the Corinthian church. And you know, what he's trying to do here, why he's thinking this is necessary, is to really, again, try to eliminate this accusation of skimming funds off for himself. You know, in chapter 9, he's already told the Macedonians that Corinth will have the collection ready. And, you know, he wants to make sure when he sends these people out that it will be ready, particularly when any Macedonians' companions arrive later. Okay, what do we know about this delegation? It's very important, remember, that he's sending these people out, and he's writing here a letter of reference to the Corinthians about these people. Who's leading the delegation? Titus, of course, yeah. Why do you think Titus was a good choice to ensure the accountability over these funds? What do we know about Titus? Actually, we know quite a bit about Titus, really. What about Titus would make this a really good choice to go to the Corinthians to jazz them up to collect some money from them? Titus has been there before. Remember, Titus was the one who delivered the severe letter that we don't think we have. He delivered that letter to the Corinthians. You know, he's already, as Stephen said, he's been there before. They knew Titus, so he had a lot of credibility with the Corinthians. And in verse 16, it says that he had a heart. Your version may be a little different. He had a heart for the Corinthians. What does Paul say? I think that's an interesting verse. What is the source of his heart for the Corinthians, Titus's heart? What does Paul say there? It comes from God. That is so typical of Paul. You know, he says that Titus has, again, your version may be different. A lot of the Greek kind of looks at the best translation is probably earnest care. You know, he has earnest care for the Corinthians. And, you know, he attributes, as David says, this earnest care that comes from God. God puts in the heart of people, you know, Paul says this a lot. He puts in the heart of people things that will fulfill his purposes in the world. You know, the Corinthians had already responded to Titus's visit with earnest care. You know, as far as we know, his visit was successful with the severe letter. When he returned to Paul, he strengthened Paul. He encouraged Paul with the good news from the Corinthians. And so, you know, again, all these events Paul attributes to being from God. Verse 6, it's not in this passage today, but verse 6 says, and Brent talked about this last week, you know, Paul urged Titus to make this first visit. But Titus, it's interesting here, it says that Titus made this visit of his own initiative. This is his own free will. You know, he's already talked about in verse 3 how the Macedonians gave of their own free will. And here Paul uses that very same word to talk about Titus's response, free will. This is the very best, if you think about it, of any kind of behavior, Christian behavior that we have. It's always good when we respond to request. You know, when we're urged, it's always good. But it's even better to do something of your own initiative, you know, voluntarily without urging. Okay, so let's take a look. We said before that David had mentioned before that Paul had used some financial prudence to reduce suspicion about the offering by sending other people to collect it. So what do we know about the men entrusted to deliver the funds? We've already mentioned Titus led the delegation. But who accompanied him? Who accompanied Titus?
Possibly Barnabas. I don't know.
Possibly Barnabas? Yeah, there's a lot of speculation. We don't really know. That's not a trick question. We really don't know who did that. Origen and Jerome suggested that the other brother, there were two brothers here, and not relatives, Bill. They're not relatives, but you know they're basically brothers in Christ. And so Origen and Jerome, early church fathers, suggested that it was Luke. Others have said Barnabas. That's kind of your second choice, is Barnabas, as Steve said. But the reason for Luke as a possibility is that he separated from Paul while they were at Philippi. We know that about 6 years before. And then he shows up again in Paul's company in Macedonia. And so in the interim, evidently this brother, maybe Luke, it's plausible, it could be Barnabas, he was so well known that he was praised throughout the churches for his service to the gospel. He had high praise. This person had high praise from the churches. Okay, the second anonymous delegate in verse 22. Verse 25 23 says that he was also chosen by the churches as their representative. Again, we don't know his name, but we know that he not only came of his own initiative, but he came because the churches selected him to be their representative. Again, Paul is saying these churches have selected this person specifically to go to you. And I think he's trying to put a little bit of pressure on the Corinthians to say, they're coming of their own initiative, and they're also coming because the churches have sent them. So you can fill in the blank for the rest, right? Right.
As to the first unnamed helper, one possibility is Apollos.
Could be.
Because Paul described him as first in the things of the gospel. If that means knowledge of the gospel, Apollos is a sort of knowledge worker himself. And Apollos was known to Paul by this time.
And I guess one other thing that would also strengthen your argument would be, in some versions it mentions that he was known for his preaching of the gospel. I think some versions say service to the gospel, but some say preaching of the gospel. That might be a good bolster to your argument that it could be Apollos. That makes sense. That's plausible too. All right? Good. We just don't know. We really don't know. He does say this. He says that he doesn't know. He doesn't say whether he says this brother has confidence in the Corinthians, and we don't know if this confidence came because Titus told him about the Corinthians, or if he had known the church in Corinth in the past. Again, we don't know. This is all speculation. But it's interesting that Paul uses the very same Greek word to describe this brother as being earnest, as it's the same word that he uses to describe Titus in general. So, he's putting Titus and this brother's earnestness on the same level, same word. Perhaps Titus was so enthusiastic, he was so fired up about the Corinthians, particularly the response he had gotten when he went with a severe letter, when he got back to Paul, that he passed this on to the other brothers, and this brother was very fired up as well. He was excited as well. I'll bring up something here that's a little bit of controversy, but it's a little bit strange that the identities of these people are anonymous. We know Titus, but we don't know the other two. Paul tries to describe them, but the question is, why weren't their names listed here? Particularly if it's somebody we probably would know. Paul lists other people in his letters that we don't know anything else about except their names. And just one thing that happens is that in ancient times, sometimes being anonymous said that if you're anonymous in some kind of writing, it meant that the people were dishonorable for some reason. So some scholars have speculated that these two, the names were in the original text. They were listed, but later on they did something that caused some dishonor, so their names were erased. Now, that's just a wild theory, but it did happen in a lot of ancient texts. And, perhaps, that the theory is, some scholars say that perhaps they maybe did something that later besmirched their names. I don't believe it for a second, and there's no manuscript evidence for any of that, but I want to throw it out there. It's kind of interesting why their names are not listed.
We know the name of Demas, and he dragged his own name in the mud.
We sure do.
And
Very good. Yeah, good example. Good counter. Ryan's on fire today, so that's good. Appreciate that. Yeah, it's a good example of, we know several people that, and Paul also said later that several people that abandoned him, in his Timothy, 2 Timothy
I was
letter.
going to ask the question that I never thought of, why not name the men?
Mhm.
And we don't really know why.
Yeah.
Could one of it be somewhat for security? In other words, if there's a letter that someone discovers
Great
that
point.
says Steve Lane, and Ron Alquist are traveling with a bunch of money,
That's a
then
great
you
point.
become a target.
That's a great point.
I don't know.
I hadn't thought of that one, but that's a real plausible one. Right.
Also heard somewhere that sometimes the person writing a letter doesn't name himself if he's already known to them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, that we have whoever wrote the letter to the Hebrews.
That's also very plausible. That
And,
makes sense.
and Paul did specifically say that at least one of them was well known to everyone, so they would have known him by sight
Mhm.
or by reputation at least.
Right. Good points.
And the second one was also someone of good repute. I don't know how famous he was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after he delivered the money or came to start the collection, he was certainly well known to them, if he wasn't already. That's interesting history, I think, but let's get into more of the practical things today. I know that we have some people in our congregation who are experienced in financial stuff. We have some accountants and we have some people here who are, we have a chief CFO and we have a banker and other people here who deal a lot with finances. I want to ask you just a practical question. On a high level, can you see what financial or auditing purposes are practiced here by Paul? Helen Lane can't answer. I'm just kidding, Helen. You're welcome to answer. Can you see with some practical things? Earl can't answer either. Look around, people I know there deal with finances a lot. Okay, it's kind of interesting here. One thing that's already been mentioned by David, you sent somebody else, right? You got some multiple eyes on the finances on this collection. And I'm going to add one more that I thought of. But, he's trying to answer this charge that I'm not profiting purposely or personally from this collection. So, he's put a treasurer or a trusted person in charge of it. And so he's trying to make sure that they can't say, Paul, you're skimming that money. You're misappropriating the funds. We do know this from the terms used here that gift was liberal. It was abundant. There was probably a lot of money involved here. And so, he's going to take special care to make sure that it's handled properly. And, Paul here talks about the virtue of being blameless. He talks a lot about that in his writings. And so, one of the major principles we said is that he's got multiple eyes, multiple hands on this collection. And so he's doing this through the Titus and his two traveling companions. The other idea I'm going to throw at you is that he obeys a foundational auditing principle here. And that auditing principle is you never put accounts payable and accounts receivable together in an organization. You never have that same person doing accounts receivable and accounts payable. Basically, auditors will tell you if it's a big enough company, you want those people in different buildings. You don't want them communicating as much as possible. And the idea here is it's the old left doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and that your east is as far as the east is the west. You want these two people. You don't want them communicating or possibly collaborating. And so, if you think about it, Paul is acting as accounts receivable. He's sending out this request for funds collection. And these people that are going are accounts payable. they're going to receive the funds separately. And so this is very wise. This is textbook auditing Paul's good judgment in setting this up.
It also, it not just protects Paul, this protects Titus and other men as well.
Yes, yes.
It does. It protects both of them.
It inoculates Titus.
Here's a real world, very applicable, local example that I hope most people are aware. Earl who's an elder, is the bookkeeper, is the accountant for the church. And this is the decision that was made wisely, I believe. Earl does not have signature authority.
No.
Make sure I understand that. Earl
Right.
cannot sign checks.
No,
And that's because we trust Earl without a doubt.
completely.
However, we want to protect Earl from any untoward tricks.
Right.
Hope I didn't overshare. And Paul is doing something similar to that here.
And
He's protecting these men.
And sometimes you may see Earl catch one of us after services or before to sign a check. And he'll tell us what it's about and, look at the amount and all that, but make sure that Earl doesn't write those checks himself.
Something else I find here that's really important is that these men aren't listed as accountants per se, but in fact, they're listed as very righteous men. And when you go back and look at the point that you did in Acts chapter 6, every one of those men whose job it was going to be to handle funds and or deliver the needs of the Grecian widows, every one of them were supposed to be chosen based on their ability to teach, their fidelity to the gospel. And so here you have the men who are listed are men of high righteous character. And beyond everything else, that's the first, like you have one of your shepherds handling your funds. You want somebody of the highest character as regards the gospel of Christ.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That comes first, right? The fact that Paul used what we would say are prudent financial considerations comes second. But the fact is he did. But the other thing is that, yeah, absolutely. These people were chosen because of their high integrity. The people knew them. They were well known. Again, it's that letter of reference that we're talking about in this section. But it's an excellent point. That's perfect. Okay? He closes this really, I'll close this pretty quickly about the section in chapter 8 because we haven't talked about chapter 9 yet. But he applies a phrase to Titus that's kind of interesting. What does he say in verse 23, 24 about Titus? And this goes again to your point about the integrity. Here he's going to highlight these people specifically. What makes them perfect for this job? What does he say? He uses a couple of terms to apply to Titus. Partner, fellow worker, right? Yes. Brother, messenger, he uses that to apply to the others, right? Yeah, that's true. Titus, again, just say something about Titus quickly. Titus dealt with messy situations for Paul. Kendall Harrison said something years ago about Titus. He said he was Paul's henchman, and he really was. Timothy had a little more delicate constitution, right? He loved Timothy as a son, but Titus was the one he sent in for the tough jobs. I mean, the last thing we know in the letter to Titus, we know he was appointed to go to these churches in Crete, of all places, and pick elders for all these places in Crete. And again, Paul says these people are, what does he say? They're lazy, they're evil gluttons, they're liars. He calls the people of Crete. In this environment, he's sending Titus to go in and appoint elders in these churches. Tough job. He got the tough jobs.
Concerning the Cretans, Paul was quoting, he said one of their prophets, one of their poets did in fact call them that. Right. Yeah, that came from their own poets. These people where I live and he was from Crete. And apparently that's where we get the word Cretan today.
Right. It's not used as a nice term at all. Okay, and the other two, and I think have been mentioned, this idea that they're messengers of the churches, and you're, depending on your translation, described as apostles in some, or they also are a glory, or they're an honor to Christ. Again, going back to your point about this is the important part about these people that Paul wanted the Corinthians to know, that they brought glory and honor to Christ in their lives. They were messengers. In fact, some translations use the term angels, which is just a messenger. That's basically what it is. That's also the use of the word apostles, they're called in some translations. Don't get hung up on that. They weren't part of the original group, but their apostles here just means that, again, they are messengers. They're representatives of. So kind of interesting there. Okay. Do you think Paul's mission was going to be well received by the Corinthians? Yeah. I think he's saying, yeah, I'm hoping. I'll talk. I hope we get there. We'll talk just real quickly about chapter 9, those verses there. But what is he challenging the Corinthians to do? You know? We have some modern phrases, basically when he's challenging the Corinthians. We would say today, put up or shut up. Don't tell me how much you care. You know, show me how much you care. Talk is cheap. Or in the words of the great philosopher Elvis, you know, a little less talk and a little more action, please. I think he's saying that. You know, or simply from the phrase, show me the money. You know, show me the money. That's what I think he's saying here. And so, you know, you get the impression that when he gets to at the end of verse or chapter 8, he's done with the discussion. He's through. And then all of a sudden he cranks up chapter 9 again. That's kind of interesting. Now, again, there are a group of minority scholars who say that he's acting like chapter 8 didn't exist. You know, and chapter 9 starts the argument again. I think there's a better explanation for that than it was some sort of, you know, weird insertion or something like that. To me, the better explanation of that is actually he's saying, I'm not quite sure about you Corinthians, so what do you do normally when you want somebody to make sure they understand a point? What do?
You tell them what you told them, and you tell them again, and then you tell them what you told them again and again and again. You have to repeat.
Exactly.
It's like elementary school kids.
Exactly.
Or adult age kids.
Right. You repeat, communicate. I think that's simply what Paul is doing in starting chapter 9. You know, he talks about this as being a ministry of the gospel, a service, and he uses terms that are even well known in the Old Testament. He talks about this gift being a eulogia, which is a gift, a solemn offering. So he's looking at that. But in verse 2, what pressure does Paul put on these Corinthians? What does he do? Now remember, he went and he bragged to the Macedonians who live in northern Greece. He bragged to the Macedonians about the Corinthians. Oh, they're stirred up, they're zealous, they're ready to give, right? And then he comes back later and he tells the Corinthians, you know, Brent brought up again last week, wonderful lesson about how to, you know, handle, these people didn't have, they were low on funds, the Macedonians, they were poor. And they gave more than they had. So they were stirred up. They were zealous. It says that Paul says many of them gave abundantly. So Paul's kind of pulling a bait and switch here, and he's saying, I stirred up the Macedonians. I'm not saying this was an evil intent type thing, but it just happened that he had bragged to the Macedonians about the Corinthians. And then the Macedonians, now he's having to say, look what they did to the Corinthians, because the Corinthians are sort of falling behind in their effort, in their collection. Why do you think they were falling behind? What do you think led to that? Evidently, they had not kind of kept up. Their zeal was waning. Doubts about Paul probably was the major thing. They had those false prophets stirring up trouble, so they were all fired up about this contribution, and then all this stuff came in the interim, and their zeal kind of dropped. All right?
When you have a lot of stuff, including money, you worry more about keeping all your stuff than money.
Mm-hmm.
When you have little money and stuff, you worry less about it.
Excellent
So I
point.
think that, and it goes along with all the warnings throughout the New Testament of the rich. This is what in the Corinthians were, in relative terms, rich.
Mhm. And so he's doing that. So, in effect, what Paul is actually doing here, he's setting up a healthy rivalry. Any good sales manager knows that the best way to get good sales in your group is to set up a competition. Salespeople are the most, I'm not saying these are salespeople, but salespeople are some of the most competitive in the world. But I think there's probably a little bit of healthy competition. Here are the Macedonians. Look what they've done, Corinthians. Now, shouldn't you rekindle your zeal? Let's get with it. Let's get going. Paul didn't want to be humiliated, right? He did not want to be humiliated. So, and later, I think Paul and some Macedonians were going to probably come down and make this get this collection. We know in Acts 20, verse 4, there was a delegation of people who went with Paul to Jerusalem to deliver this money. And probably some of those were Macedonians. Well, he didn't want the Macedonians to show up to Corinth and, where's the money? What's happened? Show me the money. Again, what has happened? He didn't want to be humiliated in this way. He didn't want the gospel to be humiliated, I think, in this way. So it's kind of interesting there. Okay, so I guess, Stephen.
So here too, it's neat from a macro sense too with these new Christians. Just like Paul is receiving a lot of persecution, and it seems like from the Jewish faith, most of the churches at this point, the persecution is coming from Jewish brethren.
Yes.
Still teaching that you need to be Jewish or become Jewish to be Christian.
Yes.
So there's still this divide between Gentile and Jew. It's in almost all of these letters that Paul's writing about.
Yes.
And so this act here of Gentiles helping Jews, Paul knows that this is going to go a long way in uniting Christians.
Right.
And so there's this really neat thing, because it doesn't seem like this would really be a big care for Paul, the money, financial, and so when you can see that he realizes that there's still this divide that exists with Christians, and this is going to help unify God's people.
It's a really big deal. And he foresees when he does show up in Jerusalem, with this gift, he foresees the impact that it's going to have. And it's a major impact. So, all this stuff about, the following the Jewish law, things like that, it kind of pales. And look what great things are going on. Because Paul talked about the great things going on with the brothers in Jerusalem, all the great things that were happening in the Gentile churches. But not only this, but he says, and this came from the goodness of their hearts. And I'm sure he could talk specifically about the churches and even the Macedonians. Look what they did. He's telling them, folks, they didn't have this money. They didn't have it. And yet look what they've done. Look what they've done. Perfect. Yeah, it's all about unity. And we're all in this together. We're all Christians together. Perfect. Okay. Just a last couple of things about this, personal applications. How do we look at giving? And I think, you can look at giving sort of four ways. And one way is a duty. I'm going to give, okay, I'm going to give this week, but it's going to be I'll look at it like I'm paying my property tax to Hamilton County or Hamilton or Chattanooga City or something like that. Second way is that you can find, self-satisfaction giving. I'm kind of doing this because I sort of feel good about it myself. It makes me feel good. And, it may be a little bit of a personal satisfaction thing. Third thing is that, motive might be prestige. I'm giving a lot. So, I really feel good about that. Maybe somebody else should know about that, maybe, or something there. And some people sort of have the idea if I pile up credit, that maybe God will look at me in a better way. When we talked about the prosperity gospel in some ways there. And the last way, and don't get me wrong, those first three methods or first three reasons are not in themselves all bad. Okay? The main thing is the gift is being made. We're not looking at the motives behind every gift that's being made. I think, but Paul might say, as he said before, the best way is to give out of love. And I think that's the thing. It's understanding what God has done for us, the grace of God. And he loved us so much that he gave his only begotten Son. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You know, all those ideas that give us that idea and that reason for giving. And that's probably the best of the other three.
All four ways benefit the receiver.
Yes.
It's only the last one that benefits the giver as well.
Right, exactly. Excellent. Hope everybody heard that. All four of those ways benefit the receiver, but the last one benefits the giver as well. I mean, the receiver as well. I messed it up, Stephen. You're quiet. Yeah. All those methods work for everybody, but the first three really are focused on the person who gives. The last also is on the person who receives. Okay, just to kind of pick up on what David said, last thing there is that I think if Paul came to us with some Macedonians and looked at Signal Mountain, he would see that we're an inordinately generous church. We've been blessed greatly, but we are a very generous church. I think he would feel that, you know, what we've done here is our generosity overflows. And you'll probably hear more about this very soon about the congregation's gifts lately to the Partners for Africa appeal. But to piggyback on what David said about the handling of funds at Signal Mountain, I think there's a great effort to follow Paul's principles of business here, and for everyone involved who handles the funds to have it take from it or approach it with a sense of stewardship and integrity. Again, we have Earl, elder, as the church treasurer. We have a deacon responsible for finance, and these positions, these men that are in these jobs have great trust and integrity, and they follow very carefully the principles that we've talked about today. There's an effort. I don't guess I've been in any other congregation where there's more of an effort to be good stewards and to handle money very carefully, to account for all receipts and transactions, to be transparent to the congregation, and to ultimately balance the books. We've had an outside auditor to look at our print practices here and you know, try to abide by all the good auditing principles. You know, we're all familiar with churches that have Christian organizations that have had great scandals. They've had less oversight. They've had less care. And they've been involved in these scandals. And, you know, we've seen all the things that have been a black eye to Christian organizations in general. And you know, there have been embezzlement, there's been fraud, there's been skimming off money and things like that. And I would say that great pains are taken here with your contributions to make absolutely sure that doesn't happen.
Amen.
Okay, any comments or closing ideas here? Stephen.
One thing we didn't mention as much when we were talking about the way they handled it is it reduces temptation.
Yes.
It's not just about protecting the reputation, but also reduces temptation.
Right.
Even those that aren't that greedy, if you put in enough money that they can live off their life, would be face a little temptation.
Exactly. A lot of possibility there, for sure.
But the way they set it up
Right.
reduces that.
Right. Okay. Okay, go ahead. Ernest. Yeah.
I was going to say, it doesn't matter what you do, your money, as long as you're doing it for Christ.
Sure.
You give the glory.
Right.
Christ will provide the means.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Great point. Ryan?
If I give all my possessions to feed the poor and deliver my body to be burned, but I do not have love, it profits me nothing.
Absolutely. Said before, Paul could write like a lyric poet. There you go. There's the evidence there. Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Our Father, we're so thankful for your love. We're so thankful for your overflowing generosity to us. We're thankful that we're here this morning to be with our fellow brothers and sisters. We're thankful that we can worship to you unencumbered, and that we can worship you, and also we can fellowship with each other. We're so thankful for the avenues that you give us for service. And Father, we pray that we will be good stewards of what you've given us. Bless us as we go out from here, as we go out this afternoon, and we pray that we will have a good reputation in your sight, but also in the sight of others who see us each day. In Jesus' name, amen.